I'm Kim Bremer, your host today for another edition of BoviNews, keeping you up to date on the cattle industry's latest in technology management, genetics, and more. It's a well-known fact that heat stress can present a major challenge to dairy cattle productivity during the hot summer months. Dairy farmers know that closely monitoring their cattle for the signs of heat stress and having protocols in place to address heat stress are important, but there's also an opportunity to abate heat stress by fine-tuning nutrition. Our presenter today is Dr. David Carlson with Vita. Dr. Carlson was raised on a small dairy farm in northwest North Dakota. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees in animal sciences from North Dakota State University and earned a PhD in animal science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Prior to joining Vita, he served in technical services roles for 4 years with Milk Products and 8 years with Elanco Animal Health. He joined Vita in 2020 as a dairy nutritionist and is based in Oregon, Wisconsin. Welcome, David.
Yeah, so happy to be here. I'm talking a little bit about nutritional strategies during heat stress. I think it's certainly timely. Early July here, it's been pretty hot. And as Kim mentioned, I work for Vita. So we are a feed company, employee-owned feed company based in Madison, Wisconsin, but we have facility locations throughout Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and then dealer partners throughout much of the upper Midwest and out into Ohio and as far west as Kansas. So what I want to talk about today is just get grounded in consequences of heat stress. I think for dairy producers, nutritionists, veterinarians, it's very well known, but we continue to learn more about the impacts of heat stress. A little bit on how to assess heat stress, quickly and effectively. Certainly we have more and more tools from a technology perspective to assess heat stress. And then finally, talk about some core heat abatement strategies, both from an environmental standpoint, as well as from a nutritional standpoint. Now to start off, just to ground ourselves, we want to talk about the temperature humidity index, often abbreviated as THI. It's like a heat index for cows, that combines environmental temperature and relative humidity. So we have different degrees of heat stress in dairy cows. We've typically defined heat stress as starting at a 68 THI, which actually might be a little bit high considering the high production of modern dairy farms these days. Some of those numbers were established many, many decades ago when cows are producing at a lower rate. So just to give you a frame of reference, a THI of 68 would be 70 degrees at 65% relative humidity. So on a common Wisconsin or upper Midwest day, it's probably mid-morning when they would start to feel heat stress. And we can go moderate, severe, and dangerous levels of THI or heat stress. Just to give you another frame of reference, last Tuesday morning, I think the heat index in southern Wisconsin reached 113 that day. We were out at a dairy, got there at 5:30 in the morning, and it was 75 degrees and 80% humidity. And the cows were hot already. So that put us at a THI of 73. Certainly it was not pleasant for anybody out there. And then later that day, it reached a high of 94 with 60% humidity. So that puts us at about 87 regarding a THI. So we were at the upper end of severe heat stress on that day. And when we think about heat stress, we want to really consider the behavior of the cow. Think about a hot group of cows in a barn on a hot day in the summer. They're probably going to stand more. What's interesting is that we want them to lie down, but their body temperatures actually heat up as they're lying down because they have less surface area available to evaporate that heat. So they'll stand up to dissipate heat. So they spend more time standing up. You'll see them breathing heavier, so an increased respiration rate. You'll see them panting, so increased salivation, as well as they're expiring or respiring more CO2 into the environment. They're just at a higher metabolic rate. They're trying to get rid of some of the detrimental things associated with heat stress and get rid of body temperature or body heat. And we'll see increased water intake, and certainly, for confinement housed dairy cows, they're in under shade, but out west with dairy farms, they'll seek shade during heat stress. So let's talk about consequences of heat stress. Some of these are very well known. We'll see milk loss. We'll see lower dry matter intake. Cows will be more prone to rumen acidosis because they're using so much sodium and so much buffer to regulate the pH of the blood that sometimes they're lacking things to buffer the rumen. Decreased repro performance. Some dairies just don't breed during the summer because they don't want to deal with low fertility, and then also we have embryonic loss that is common during the hot heat of the summer. Cows are standing more, so they're increased risk of lameness, compromised immune system. We'll see shorter gestation lengths, so 5 to 10 days shorter, which leads into decreased calf birth weight. We see increased twinning, especially in the breedings following heat stress. So if we have cows that are in very early lactation right now, once they come out of heat stress, we'll see increased double ovulations, and those breedings may result in increased twinning. And due to the challenges with regard to energy balance and cow behavior, we see reductions in body weight and body condition score. Now, I'm going to set up this slide here. It's a little bit complicated, but it was a really neat study establishing that heat stress cows have a very unique metabolism. So these cows were housed in environmental chambers so they could control the heat, control the environment for these cows, and induce experimental heat stress. So there were two groups. The first was the heat stress group. So they were held at a certain THI, and it just mimicked a hot Arizona day, basically. They got up to about 85 THI. So they were fed ad libitum, so they had free choice access to feed. And then the pair-fed group was held in a thermoneutral environment, but they were fed the same amount that the heat stress cows ate voluntarily. So it was to take away the impact of higher intake when compared to. So the control group was not heat stress, but they were consuming less nutrients. So they implemented heat stress, and then so on day one, the heat stress cows ate X amount less. So the next day they would reduce the pair-fed group by that same amount. So it was so they followed the heat stress group down the path of lower intake. So the upper left-hand corner, we see that dry matter intake declined for both groups. The pair-fed group was experimentally induced, but the heat stress group, that's the dashed line, that declined significantly in the first 3 days upon 3 to 4 days upon inducing heat stress. On the bottom left-hand corner is milk yield. So both groups declined in milk yield, but the heat stress group declined farther. So they had a more severe drop in milk yield despite consuming about the same amount of nutrients. So let's look at the graph on the right-hand side. That is non-esterified fatty acids. And so those are indicators of how much those cows are mobilizing body fat. Typically, we see this in very early lactation when cows are in negative energy balance and they mobilize their body stores to help close the gap of energy balance. But what you'll see here is the pair-fed cows. So those are the non-heat stressed, lower intake cows. They were able to mobilize body fat to help close the gap of energy balance. But the heat stress cows did not mobilize body fat. They just weren't able, their metabolism was regulated in such a way they weren't able to draw on their body stores to help maintain their energy balance throughout heat stress. So in summary, this study showed that heat stress cows had a greater decline in milk yield, less body fat mobilization, they had greater blood insulin, so their glucose metabolism was impacted. And in summary, they have just a very unique metabolic profile versus a cow in a thermoneutral environment. So this will become important as we discuss later on when we evaluate feed additives to use during heat stress. And this slide here shows the entire US federal milk marketing order, very well known that herds will decline in milk fat percentage during the summer. So this goes back to 2012 up to 2021. You can see just overall, the industry has progressed greatly in terms of raising milk fat percentage on a herd basis, but that decline still exists. So starting, we'll peak in December and reach a low in July. Every year, you can pretty much count on that. So what we want to do is do what we can from an environmental perspective, but also from a nutritional perspective to try limit that dip throughout the summer. So assessment of heat stress, the gold standard would be to track body temperature, which is invasive. It's not an easy thing to get at on a repeated and herd basis. But our action level would be 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit for body temperature. Normal is 101.5. So if a cow is greater than 102.2 in the afternoon, they're exhibiting heat stress and they're at risk of reduced milk yield and reduced fertility. But if you're walking a pen or walking through the feed alley, respiration rate can be a useful tool to evaluate the degree of heat stress because there is a strong relationship between respiration rate and rectal temperature. So what I do is I just set a 20 or 30-second timer on my phone and have it count down, and I'll pick a cow, count how many respirations she has during that period of time. If it's 30 seconds and I counted 30 respirations, then I'll multiply that by 2. That means her respiration rate is 60 respirations or breaths per minute. If you look at the table on the bottom right, normal for a thermoneutral cow would be 40 to 45 breaths per minute. 60 in that example would approximate to be about a body temperature of 102.3, and then breaths per minute of 80 is correlated to a body temperature of 103.2. So I would say our action level here is 60. If we see a large proportion of cows at 60 breaths per minute or greater, that tells us that those cows are feeling hot. They're undergoing heat stress. So this slide here is talking about facility characteristics that are important for cow cooling. So this is a single slide, but it's probably the most important one from a heat abatement standpoint. We have 4 components of cow cooling. First would be shade. Then we want air velocity. So we want to maintain, ideally, we want to maintain 4 to 6 miles per hour constant breeze over the cows when they lie down. Water can refer to both drinking water as well as water applied to the backs of the cows to help with evaporative cooling. And then time would refer to the duration of those cooling episodes, how often they occur every hour, and how long just time would be aspects of your heat abatement program. So when we think about areas to prioritize for heat abatement, first would be the holding pen. That's really the most hostile area on the whole farm with regard to heat stress. The cows are bunched together, they're all standing up, and we want to apply water, apply air velocity to those cows on a frequent basis when it's hot out. Secondly, would be far off and close-up cows. This has been an area of research recently where we've recognized and learned that heat stress during that close up period can have major downstream effects, not only for that cow in the next lactation, but also for her offspring when they become part of the milking herd. Then third would be maternity, fresh cows and heifers, your highest producing groups, as well as the milking parlor. But I cannot emphasize this enough that when we think about the outcomes of heat stress, behavior of heat stress cows, those can be highly impacted by the environment, by heat abatement strategies to help improve that cow's environment so she can exhibit her normal behaviors and be a profitable cow. But really, we want to talk about nutritional strategies during heat stress. So let's just think we have a good setup for heat abatement in the barn. We're happy with how cows do, but they still get hot. I mean, there's no way around it. Heat stress is a factor even on the most well managed and even the best barns out there. So some of these strategies are things to think about to just raise the bar, help those cows through this heat stress period. First is water access, rumen health, fat supplementation, increasing DCAD, utilizing metabolic modifiers, thinking about that very unique metabolic state that those cows are in. We want to leverage some of the compounds or nutrients that we can use in that category. And finally, gut health aids, which we'll get into later on. So let's talk about drinking water recommendations. So cows will drink more during the heat. Humans drink more during the heat. Everybody does. So our thumb rule for water space in the barn is 4 linear inches per cow. So this is, if you're looking at a water, it's anywhere that the cow has access to. So it's not the back of the water, it's the sides and the front. I'm thinking of like a crossover water. So we want at least 2 locations per pen, and generally we want waters located every 80 feet in a pen. So if we have 100 cows in a pen, we want at least 2 waters. We want at least 400 linear inches total within that pen of 100 cows. And another thing we want to think about is when cows leave the parlor, they drink a large proportion of their daily allotment during that period. So we figure about 10% of their daily water intake occurs right after milking. So if a herd is milking 3 times a day, they would drink 30% of their water right after milking. So leaving the parlor and then going out into their pens. So the one strategy folks have used is to put together these low cost PVC type waterers. You can see on the picture on the right where they're, high output. A lot of cows can drink at one time. They leave the parlor and they can just drink and drink and drink. So that's one way to improve water access during the summer. And our guidelines here is we want 2 feet of linear space of water space for each cow exiting the parlor at one time. So let's say we have a double 10 parallel parlor and we let 20 cows total in the parlor, let 10 go. We want at least 20 feet of linear space for those 10 cows leaving the parlor. The second point is maintaining a healthy rumen. I just want to emphasize that these are goals all throughout the year. We want a healthy rumen no matter what. But during heat stress, some things that may not be issues throughout the rest of the year are exacerbated or become issues during heat stress. So the first goal is to optimize rumen fermentation. We want to provide adequate effective fiber. We know that as corn silage stays in a pile, or the longer it stays in the pile, we get increased starch availability. And that applies to high moisture corn as well. So if we want to account for that in rations. When we think about cows are more prone to rumen acidosis, we want to make sure that we're accounting for that increased starch availability throughout the summer. And we also want to pay attention to ration dry matter and sortability. The drier ration gets, the more sortable it is. So we want to make sure that cows are consuming the ration that, as a nutritionist, that I'm balancing, and they're not sorting for concentrates, for example, that could be further detrimental to rumen acidosis. Want to prioritize fiber digestibility? This could include allocating highly digestible forages. We want to make sure that we're providing highly digestible feeds to the cows during a time where their intake might be declining, and so they can get as much energy out of that feed as possible. And we could also utilize non-forage fiber sources during this time to increase the energy of the diet and take the place of lower quality forage. Third aspect is feed management. Again, these are things we need to think about all year long. But wet forages are increased risk of heating during the summer. So we want to make sure we manage those silo faces. We don't want to knock down too much corn silage or haylage during the facing process, because that'll be prone to heating if you intend on feeding it the next day. We want to keep an eye on feed uniformity, make sure our mixer is operating like we want it to, and maintain access to feed. So it's challenging during the summer when intakes might be a little more up and down. Could be 95 one day and 70 the next. But slug feeding during a hot weather spell is not a good thing, because again, we talked about rumen health. Slug feeding can drop them into rumen acidosis quite easily. And finally, we want to evaluate rumen modifying feed additives. So these would fall in the category of yeast cultures, microbial products, ionophores, buffers, things that can help the rumen stay healthy and operate at the highest efficiency possible. Next category would be fat supplementation. So we recognize that the rumen is a big source of heat production for cows. It's a furnace. That's why they're perfectly comfortable at 20 degrees, because that rumen puts out a lot of heat during the digestion process. So if we rank the different categories of feeds, first would be forages in terms of producing the most heat in the rumen, followed by grains, and then fats. So that's why we suggest fat supplementation during the summer, because that has a very low heat production in the rumen. Increasing grain can certainly negatively impact rumen health, as we just talked about. And fats have 2.25 times greater energy density when you compare fat versus carbohydrates. So by feeding fat, we can increase the energy density of the diet with and then lessen the heat production in the rumen. So this makes sense when cows may be eating a little bit less, they can get more per pound of feed if we increase the energy density with fat. But we do want to use rumen inert sources. So these would be sources that bypass the rumen, digested in the intestine, where plant oils, and I'm thinking of like distiller's grain or roasted soybeans, lots of energy in there, but it can have a negative impact on rumen fermentation and increase your risk of milk fat depression during a time when you're at a pretty high risk already. So the next category would be increasing DCAD. So DCAD means dietary cation anion difference. So it's positive charges subtracting negative charges gives you a DCAD value. In pre-fresh cows, we talk about negative DCAD diets. But in lactating cows, we want to increase DCAD. We want it more positive. As talked about earlier, cow behavior during heat stress. We have panting, sweating, increased salivation. We increase electrolyte loss, higher demand on on electrolytes. So we want to aim to provide sodium and potassium in particular. And we want to do that with sources that don't carry with it a negative charge. So feeding more salt, so that would be sodium and chloride, that won't get us very far on impacting DCAD because the chloride is canceling out the sodium. So we want to use sources that would increase the positive charges. So those would be sodium bicarbonate, sodium S-carb, and then potassium carbonate. Those would be the most effective supplements for increasing DCAD during heat stress. And we can also do it with feedstuffs. So feedstuffs that are high in sodium and potassium would be haylage, whey permeate, soybean meal. There are others out there. Sodium and potassium values in your hay are, and then whey permeate is a great way to bring some sodium to the ration. And finally, we want to talk about feed additives in particular. So before we were talking about nutrients, carbohydrates, fats, minerals. So in my mind, I'm thinking of two different categories here. First being metabolic modifiers. So these would aid the cow in adapting to heat stress. So we know that her body is adapting to hot weather. So there are ways to provide feed additives that can help these processes. So the one category would be vasodilation. And we know that niacin and essential oils can induce or increase vasodilation. So what this means is that just the blood vessels are dilated so that they can get greater blood flow, particularly to the skin. So they bring more blood to the skin and help dissipate more heat through the skin. And then glucose metabolism. And in this category, it could be chromium, ionophores, knowing that cows are, their metabolism really wants to conserve glucose. They're not mobilizing fat. So we really need to focus on ways to improve glucose metabolism, and chromium and ionophores like monensin have been shown to do that. And another category that is becoming more well understood would be gut health during heat stress. We know that stressful events that decrease dry matter intake can cause a phenomenon called leaky gut. So the gut becomes more permeable. I think it's an adaptation to stress to try get more nutrients into the cow. But with that, there's some other bad stuff that happens during leaky gut. So there's been some research and considerations given to feed additives that can improve intestinal integrity. And these would be the microbial type products, so probiotics, prebiotics, toxin binders, both mold as well as pathogen binders like a moss product, and organic trace minerals that have been shown to improve intestinal integrity as well. So again, I want to stress that managing the cow's environment is the first priority. Second priority is evaluating well-researched feed additives that can help that cow adapt to heat stress. So in summary today, we know that heat stress has many negative outcomes for dairy cows. We talked about that heat-stressed cows have very unique metabolism. They don't mobilize fat despite eating less dry matter. So we really need to focus on that glucose metabolism of the cows. And again, the priority is manage cow housing. How are we keeping our cows cool? Most often this is ventilation, shade, soakers. The farms are investing a lot of money into improving ventilation with the express goal of improving cow comfort during the summer. And then the other priority would be nutrition. We want to do the things that we want to do all year with regard to rumen health. We want to maintain dry matter intake, maximize digestibility, use the right sources of energy. we want to make sure we're managing the feed properly. Again, we don't want to have a bunch of heated up, spoiled feed, because that's those bacteria that are causing the heat in the heated feed. They're chewing up nutrients that aren't going to be able to use by the cows. And finally, using select feed additives that we know can help the cow do a better job adapting to heat stress.
Thank you, David. You covered a lot of ground, so just a couple questions as we wrap up today. When looking specifically at rations, what things should be monitored to avoid heat stress, or are there things to do or feed before the weather changes?
That's a good question. We want to make sure if we know that we want to limit stressors on the cows when we know heat stress is coming. So if we know we have maybe some toxin issues in forages, let's make sure our binder is in at the right level. It's making sure that if we have a choice of different forages, if we have some really good first crop, highly digestible first crop versus fourth crop last year, whatever, getting that highly digestible feed incorporated into the rations. So knowing that cows are going to decline in intake during these hot spells to get to maximize nutrient intake during the hot spells.
And how about the return on investment on feed additives? How should producers prioritize? Is it metabolic modifiers, gut health aids, or is that really more specific to each farm?
Yeah, I think ROI is really tough to measure sometimes, especially when you look at fertility. Some of the ones I mentioned are very low cost. It's five-ish cents per cow per day. So in my mind, I prioritize the ones that have the greatest chance of a high ROI, and that's usually the less expensive ones because you have a much lower hurdle to jump over to get an ROI. So I'm thinking like talking to coworkers. Again, I'm not endorsing specific products, but we really look at sodium, potassium, chromium, maybe niacin and then we typically feed those the gut integrity additives if we know there's stress coming. If we know we have a bad section of a silo coming, or those can be really good insurance as well.
And lastly, what's the most common thing you see on your farm visits that you wish more producers would be able to change or address to help with heat abatement?
Yeah, I think it's, if I was more entrepreneurial, I would have a more advanced control box for soakers. It's so frustrating. It's frustrating for me, and I'm not the one paying the bills to pump out the lagoon, but it's really frustrating to see the soakers turn on when the pen is empty, when all the cows are in the parlor. So coming up with smart control boxes. I know there are soakers out there that only operate when a cow is standing under it, but there may be some lower cost options too to make those soakers operate more efficiently.
And is there any, what's coming down the tubes as far as new research being done?
I'm really excited about all the wearable technology, like the activity monitoring systems that I know two of them for sure that that can give you some data regarding heat stress in a group of cows. So it gives you a threshold or percentage of cows that are heavy breathing, for example. So that can give you real-time feedback on, okay, this group of cows is not being cooled appropriately. What can I do to improve it? So the activity monitoring systems like the ones that are used for reproduction and rumination, and there are heat abatement algorithms within those systems that are pretty exciting.
It is exciting. My thanks to you, David, for joining us today and sharing your invaluable expertise and experience. Don't forget to subscribe to the BoviNews channel on YouTube, find our BoviNews podcast on your favorite listening platform, or find more information at bovinews.com. Thanks for tuning in with us today, and we'll see you next time on another edition of BoviNews.